Good morning, everybody. We're going to go ahead and get started. The first thing we're going to do is a few announcements here. Remember, Easter's coming up. We have Easter cards over here that will assist you in inviting others. I'd like to pack the place out. And also, this weekend, Saturday, March 23rd, that's our campfire, our spring campfire. Please join us. I've noticed there's not been a lot of people sign up, and we don't know how much food I think to make, so we really need you to sign up so we kind of have a better idea. But we're going to have a great time. We always do. And so I enjoy seeing you guys, and we'll hang out a little bit, eat some good food, and have fun. We're also just bringing a few things for Em, about ready to give birth here pretty soon. And so that would be nice just to bless her. And I think we're also having some of Felix's family, so we'll be able to minister to them as well. All right. I was reading in Hebrews today, and this really struck me as just it just touched my heart. Hebrews chapter 10 said, "Therefore, brothers, since we have confidence to enter the holy places by the blood of Jesus, by the new and living way that he opened for us through the curtain, that is, through his flesh, and since we have a great priest over the house of God, let us draw near with a true heart in full assurance of faith, with our hearts sprinkled clean from an evil conscience and our bodies washed with pure water. Let us hold fast the confession of our hope without wavering, for he who promised is faithful. And let us consider how to stir up one another to love and good works, not neglecting to meet together, as is the habit of some, but encouraging one another, and all the more as you see the day drawing near." And I thought it was really good. You're the ones that showed up this morning. And so we're going to stir up one another in love and good works, and we're going to encourage one another. That's why we do this, and that's why God encourages us to show up consistently for church. So thank you for coming this morning. Let's go ahead and worship.
Well, good morning.
Good morning.
I broke the stand last week, so we're borrowing theirs. It must have just been a little too wild and a little too rough. But this one's a lot lower, so if you see me squinting and bending over, it's because I can't read. I do have bifocals now, or what do they call them now? The transitions, or whatever. And they do magnify, so maybe I won't have to bend over as much now, hopefully. Shut up. I heard the wow. I don't know who said it. No, I'm kidding. Well, we finished up in the Ten Commandments last week, and then we're going to look at this story in Genesis 13 and 14 this week, and then next week Marcus is going to speak for us. So excited about that. I'm really building them up, Marcus, so you got to deliver, you know.
Got to prime them.
Oh, that's great. But in this story, this progression of sin that we're going to look at today, there is this story in Genesis 13 and 14, and it even kind of spills over into some other chapters. And it kind of tells the story about a man who goes through a lot of the same things we do. We sometimes feel like we just kind of get stuck in that cycle. Like we just can't, there's just that one thing that trips us up. Have you ever felt like that? That one thing you just can't, man, it's just, oh my goodness, it just keeps coming and coming and coming, and I think I got it beat, and then it comes back, and I don't know why, but I just keep going back to it, and I want to break free, and I want to have freedom, and I don't want to go back to it, but I just keep doing it again and again and again, and I don't know how I keep ending up there, but I keep ending up there. And if you've ever felt like that, you're going to really relate to, not just the people in this room, because we all said we feel like that, right? But the guy in the story today. So Genesis 13. This is a neat story that I love, and you've probably heard it a million different times, but we're going to look at it from a little different angle today. So here we are, Genesis 13. So Abram left Egypt and traveled north to the Negev, along with his wife and Lot, and all that they owned. Abram was very rich in livestock, silver, and gold. From the Negev, they continued traveling by stages toward Bethel, and they pitched their tents between Bethel and Ai, where they had encamped before. This was the same place where Abram had built the altar, and there he worshiped the Lord again. Lot, who was traveling with Abram, had also become very wealthy with flocks and sheep and goats, herds and cattle and many tents. But the land could not support both Abram and Lot with all their flocks and herds living so close together. So disputes broke out between the herdsmen of Abram and Lot at the time the Canaanites and Perizzites were also living in the land. Finally, Abram said to Lot, let's not allow this conflict to come between us and our herdsmen. After all, we're close relatives. The whole countryside is open to you. Take your choice of any selection of the land you want, and we'll separate. If you want the land to the left, I'll go to the land to the right. If you prefer the land to the right, I'll go to the land to the left. In this story, we've seen... Oh, I jumped too far ahead on you, didn't I?
Yes.
I'm sorry. Somebody just yell at me when I do that. I get a little click crazy. I like to hit buttons. I love buttons. My wife says I'm really good at pushing her buttons, but I love buttons. So in this story, we've got Abraham and Lot. And Lot, a lot of times, doesn't get the credit that I think he deserves. Abraham, we talk about Abraham all the time. Abram left his home, packed everything up, left his family, left everything to go to a place that God was going to tell him where to go. But Lot went with him. And a lot of times we don't stop and think about it took Lot as much faith as it did Abraham to do that. He had to pack up everything that he had to. He had to leave his family, not knowing where they were going. So I believe Lot was a saved man if he was in today's day, but I believe that he had a lot of faith that he just doesn't get credit for. He had the faith to follow, just like Abraham did. So they pack out or take off together to head on this journey following God. And while they're following God, going to this place, they run into some conflict. And if you haven't figured it out by now, whenever you're following God, you're going to face conflict. Right? It just feels like sometimes you just wish the devil would leave you alone. Well, that's when he comes after us even harder, is when we're following after God. So the question is not, am I going to face conflict while on this path that God has put me on? The question is, how am I going to handle the conflict on the path that God has put me on? So Abraham and Lot, they finally decide probably the best thing for us to do is let's just separate so we quit fighting. So you go one direction, I'll go the other. We'll figure it all out. In verse 10, Lot took a long look at the fertile plains of Jordan Valley in the direction of Zoar. The whole area was well watered everywhere, like the garden of the Lord, or the beautiful land of Egypt. This was before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. So Lot takes this long look down into this beautiful valley, and it's right where Sodom and Gomorrah are, these two cities that he thought looked like. It actually says it looks like the garden of the Lord. What's that mean? What's the garden of the Lord?
Garden of Eden.
Yeah, the Garden of Eden. Lot looks down and says, man, this is beautiful. It looks just like the Garden of Eden. One, how would Lot have known? He'd never been there. But he'd heard about it, right? It's not been that many generations ago. So it looks beautiful. It looks like the garden of the Lord, or the beautiful land of where? Egypt. He's comparing the Garden of Eden to Egypt. What a comparison. Oh, this is beautiful. It looks like heaven. It looks just like Egypt. The two shouldn't go together. But Lot looks at it and says, man, this is a beautiful area. It looks really good. He's comparing these three places. But here's how the progression of sin starts. Here's the path that led Lot to the place that he never expected to be. Lot's downward spiral began with a simple look. He just looked. He hadn't made a wrong decision yet, but he's looking that direction. Lot saw that the grass was literally greener on the other side. Boy, that looks nicer down there. He saw what the world had to offer, and he wanted what the world had to offer. He looked down there and he wanted what he thought was best. And in his eyes, this looks more beautiful than this. This has greener grass for my herds and my cattle and my sheep and my donkeys, and this looks better than here. So that's what I'm going to do. He did what he thought was best. But you know what Lot didn't do? He didn't do what God thought was best. And he never asked God either. He didn't bother to think about what God thought. And our eyes can trick us. Have you ever, our eyes, really, they can deceive us really big time. Have you ever been tricked? You ever watch a magician? I was playing with Joe yesterday. Hi, buddy. And as little kids, sometimes you'll pull a penny out of their ear or that little trick. So I did it to him. He started crying. He thought he had pennies in his ear. He couldn't get them out. Do you have pennies in your ear, Joe? No, they're not there. We had a long talk about how there's not really pennies in their ears. It was tricks. He was really concerned, though, about pennies being in his ear. But our eyes can really trick us. And sin always starts with a simple look, and it can trick us. We begin by entertaining it in our mind, and then look at verse 11. Lot chose for himself the whole Jordan Valley to the east of them. He went with his flocks and his servants and parted companies with his uncle Abram. So not only did Lot look, but then Lot made a choice. After looking at Sodom, then he makes this conscious choice to head in that direction. He started moving towards Sodom. His heart was headed in that direction, and God's very interested in the direction of our heart. So let me ask you, who do you think God is more pleased with? Somebody who looks like they've got it all together. They're, in church, they dress the part, they look the part, but on the inside, they're just far from God and don't really care? Or someone who may not look like they've got it all together, but on the inside, they're following after God. They're really wanting to do what's right. Which one do you think God is more pleased with? The second one. Yeah, obviously God is looking at our heart. He wants to know the direction that our heart is going. So verse 12, Abram at this time settled in the land of Canaan, and Lot moved his tents to the place near Sodom and settled among the cities of the plain. Now, that's an interesting verse because Lot moved his tents to a place near Sodom. He didn't jump right in. Now Lot's trying to play both sides. He moved down close to Sodom. He still didn't want anybody to think he was a part of what was going on in the city because he had to know what was going on in the city. There's no way he moved down there without knowing what was going on in that city and knowing what that city was like. And we'll find out what that city was like in just a few minutes and how easy it would have been for him to see what it was like. But he's trying to be close, but not too obviously close. Close enough to just see and be a little bit on the edge, but still have that separation and deniability. This still looks good. I'm living here. I'm living closer. Taking the next step down there. I'm not really a part of it yet. He's trying to cover up his intentions, but his heart and his house was pointed the wrong way. Verse 13 goes on. But the people of the area were extremely wicked and constantly sinning against the Lord. After Lot had gone, the Lord said to Abram, look as far as you can to see in every direction, north and south and east and west. I'm going to give all this land as far as you can see to you and your descendants as a permanent possession. And I will give you so many descendants that like the dust of the earth, they can't be counted. Go and walk through the land in every direction. By the way, that's the same direction that Lot moved to. God was saying, I'm giving all this to you. For I am giving it to you. So Abram moved his camp to Hebron and settled near an oak grove belonging to Mamre. There he built another altar to the Lord. About this time, we're jumping into the next chapter, Genesis 14, because remember when the Bible was written, they didn't put chapters and verses in there. Okay? Chapters and verses came a lot later for us while we're studying to be able to find things. So this is one story that just continues. Verse 14, about this time, war broke out in the region. So Abram and Lot have separated. Lot's moved down close to Sodom. He's living close to the city, not in it yet. Abram's still living up here on the other side. God has talked to Abram, said, I'm going to give you all of this. And then war breaks out. These different kings start to come down and fight against Sodom and Gomorrah. And all of these things start happening. The second group of kings down in verse 3, coming from the valley of the Dead Sea, verse 4. 12 years had been subject to this other king and 13 years of here. And it's going through all of these names, and I'm skipping them so I don't have to read the names to you. Right? Who would name their kid Cato Lamar? I mean, some of these names are just pretty rough, right? So, all of these kings are coming down. Then we get down to verse 7. They turned back and came to in Mishpat, now called Kadesh, and conquered the territory of the Amalekites and the Amorites living in the Haze of Tamar. And the rebel kings of Sodom, Gomorrah, Amah, Zebulun, Bela, also called Zoar, prepared for battle against in the valley of the Dead Sea. So they're getting ready to go to this. This big battle is coming. All these other kings are coming down against the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah. And they fight against these kings. It's this big, huge battle is about to take place. It's a big deal. It's not just a little skirmish. We're talking about countries teaming up and going to war. As it happens in verse 10, the valley of the Dead Sea was filled with tar pits, and the army of the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah fled. Some fell into the tar pits while the rest escaped into the mountains. Things start going south for the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah, and they take off. All these other kings come against them. All these other countries come down to do battle against Sodom and Gomorrah, and they lose. So they start running. They're retreat. They're in full retreat, running away. The victorious invaders then plundered Sodom and Gomorrah and headed for home, taking with them all the spoils of war and the food supplies. They also captured Lot, Abram's nephew, who lived where? He's not living outside of town anymore, is he? Now he's in town. He's living in Sodom and carried off everything he owned. You see, he started just by looking, and then he thought and made a decision to move down. Then he's staying on the outside. Now Lot's just in full-blown rebellion. He's living right in the middle of this city that is in full open rebellion against God and living in open sin. Finally got tired of what we would call living the double life, wanting to look good in certain lights, but not in others. Quit caring what Abraham thought about him, what his other Christian friends thought. Now he's living in Sodom, just doing whatever he wants, living no different than the world, living no different than a lost person. How do we know? We're going to see how he was living. But something happens here. They lose, and he's kidnapped. He's gone. Verse 13. But one of Lot's men escaped and reported everything to Abram the Hebrew, who was living near the oak grove belonging to Mamre the Ammonite, Mamre and his relatives, Eshcol and Aner and Abram's allies. When Abram heard that his nephew Lot had been captured, he mobilized the 318 trained men who had been born to his household. Then he pursued Chedorlaomer's army until he caught up with them at Dan. So Abram hears, hey, Lot, my nephew, who came here with me, I feel responsible for in some ways because he's followed me. He's taken captive, so we're gonna organize our men and we're gonna go after him. Then he divided his men and attacked during the night. Chedorlaomer's army fled, but Abram chased them as far as Heboah, north of Damascus. So Abram goes after him, and look what happens. Abram recovered all the goods that had been taken, and he brought back his nephew Lot with his possessions and all the women and other captives. After Abram returned from his victory over Chedorlaomer and all his allies, the king of Sodom went over to meet him in the valley of Sheva. That's called the King's Valley. And Mishkadesh, the king of Salem, was a priest of Melchizedek, the king of Salem, and the priest of the Most High God brought Abram some bread and wine. I am having to lean forward a little bit to read. So Abram recovers everything, not just Lot and not just what Lot has, but Abram recovers everything that has been taken. So this king of Sodom and the king of Salem, Melchizedek, who we all have talked about in the past, and if you've studied the Bible, you know about Melchizedek, the king of Salem, who's a picture of God, the priest of the Most High God, brought Abram some bread and wine. Verse 19, Melchizedek blessed Abram with his blessing. Blessed be Abram by God Most High, creator of heaven and earth, and blessed be God Most High, who has defended your enemies for you. And Abram gave Melchizedek a tenth of all the goods he had recovered. This is the first part of tithing, showing tithing in the scriptures as being pre-law. It comes before the law. We talked about that when we went through the Ten Commandments. But here, God is really trying to get Lot's attention, don't you think? I mean, God's giving Lot another chance. Abram hears about what's happened to Lot, comes to help, and that's how we should respond to when those that we care about get tripped up or they're away from the Lord. We should reach out and help them, not just cut them off or whatever. So Abram goes after them, and then the next part of the story is pretty amazing. Okay, I'm just going to tell you so we don't read all of it and takes up so much time. So these angels come to visit Abraham. They tell Abram and Sarah that they're going to have a son, and at this time, how old's Abram? He's old. He's real old. When he has his son, he's 100. Right here, he's about 90. And they tell his wife, Sarah, or Sarai, that she's going to have a child, and she's old too. She's probably around 80 at this time. And what did they do? Laugh. You know anybody who's 90 years old? Remember Bill Kincaid? I loved Bill Kincaid. Can you imagine somebody walking up to Bill Kincaid and saying, hey, Bill, before he passed away, hey, Bill, you're going to have a kid. Can you imagine what Bill would have thought and said? Now, Bill was in good shape, and whenever we would go out he loved to go to Chick-fil-A. And whenever I would go to Chick-fil-A with Bill, he would get in the car. He would drive. He wouldn't let me drive. And he scared me to death driving. He would literally, we pulled into Chick-fil-A one day, and it was before they remodeled it, so we pulled up right by the doors, and he just stops in the middle of the road and turns and looks at me and starts talking. And these horns are honking around us, people trying to get all over it. How old was Bill? He's in his 90s, I think at the time maybe 92 or 93, because I think he passed when he was 95, wasn't it? Something like that. So it was probably a year or two before he passed away, but yeah, in his mid-90s, just turns and looks at me and stops. I mean, what's he care? Anybody going to say anything to a 90-some-year-old man sitting in his van in the middle of the road? But yeah, can you imagine? Yeah, they laughed. Of course they did. Then Genesis 18, the next verse says, then the men got up from their meal and looked out toward Sodom. So these men, these angels, who just told Abram and Sarah that they're going to have a baby, looked down toward Sodom. Just like what Lot did. Remember, Lot looked down there and saw this beautiful plain. Everything is great. It looks good. So these guys looked toward Sodom. And they left Abraham and went with him, left Abraham. I can't even read. As they left Abraham, went with them to send them on their way. So these angels looked towards Sodom and had this serious conversation with Abraham. And then in verse 20, it says, the Lord told Abraham, I have heard a great outcry from Sodom and Gomorrah because their sin is so flagrant. I'm going down to see if their actions are as wicked as I have heard. If not, I want to know. The other men turned and headed towards Sodom, but the Lord remained with Abraham. That's how we know this is the Lord and some angels who came to visit Abraham. And he says he's going to go look. So Abraham, verse 23, approached him and said, will you sweep away both the righteous with the wicked? Suppose you find 50 righteous people living in the city. Will you sweep it away and not spare it for their sakes? I mean, God, if there's 50 righteous people, would you spare the city? So the Lord replied, if I find 50 righteous people in Sodom, I will spare the entire city for their sake. 50. So a deal is struck between Abram and Abram and God to spare the city if there's 50. And we all know the story. Then Abram feels pretty bad and decides, well, what if there's 45? And he starts to negotiate with God, just like what we do. Right? If there's 45, God, can we do it for 45? Would you do it for 45, God? Well, what about 40, Lord? Would you do it for 40? If there's 40 good people, okay, 40. Okay, how about 30? How about 30? Oh, what about 20? If there's 20. So finally, Abraham said, Lord, please don't be angry with me if I speak one more time. Lord, please don't be angry. Suppose there's only 10 found there, and the Lord replied, I will not destroy it for the sake of 10. 10. 10. Later, we're going to find out how many kids did Lot have. 2 daughters, that's right. And they had 2 husbands. So you got Lot, you got his wife, you got 2 daughters and 2 sons-in-law. How many people is that? All they had to reach was 4 people. And all the time that they lived there, all they had to do was make a difference in 4 people's lives. And God would have spared the entire city. Verse 19, or chapter 19, next chapter, verse 1. That evening, the 2 angels came to the entrance of the city of Sodom. Lot was sitting there. He's sitting at the gates now. And when he saw them, he stood up to meet them. Then he welcomed them and bowed his face to the ground. Now these 2 angels are coming to visit the city, and Lot's sitting at the gates. So God's given Lot a chance already. He took him into captivity, and Abram came and rescued him. God has given Lot a second chance. Did Lot move away and say, okay, Lord, I get it. I'm going to get away from this bad influence on my life and my family's life. I'm going to move away, and I'm going to follow you? No, the next time we see Lot, he's sitting in the gates of the city. Now, Lot was leading other people into that kind of lifestyle. The gates of the city is where the city leaders were found. These were the city council members who would sit at the gates. This is where people would bring their civil disagreements. This was court. Lot was one of the members of the city leaders. This is where the city laws were passed. These were the influencers of the city. These were the people who were in charge of the city. Now Lot's sitting with them. He's one of them. Not only is Lot outside of town, now he's moved past that. Now he's not just living in town. Now he's an elected official. He's one of the leaders. And he decides to take these two angels into his home. And when he takes them into his home, it gets dark, and the men of Sodom come to Lot's door and knock on his door and say, send us the two men that came out. We want to do all kinds of unspeakable things to them. And Lot says something that blew me away the first time I remember reading it and seeing it. He says, don't do anything to these two men here. I have two virgin daughters. Let me give them to you, and you can do whatever you want to them. Does that sound like somebody who's following after God? Hey, here's my two daughters. They're both virgins. Take them and have your way with them. What kind of dad would say that about his girls? What kind of man would even think like that? The angels tell Lot what God's about to do to the city and warn him and tell him he needs to get everybody he loves and get out of the city quick. Verse 14. So Lot rushed to tell his daughters, fiancés, these are the two son-in-laws to be, quick, get out of the city, the Lord's about to destroy it. But the young men thought he was only joking. He's not serious. So Lot tries to warn his family to get out before the judgment comes, but even his own family doesn't believe him. So Lot barely escapes with his wife and his two daughters just before the judgment falls, and the angels warn them, don't even look back at the city. And so they take off running, but what happens? Lot's wife doesn't listen. Verse 26 says, Lot's wife looked back, and she was following behind him, and she turned into a pillar of salt. Lot finally convinces his wife and daughters to run, but Lot's wife looked back. She just wanted to, she couldn't get past her past. She couldn't let go of her past. All of my stuff is down there, my family, my home. That home that I've spent so much time decorating and building to be, she couldn't leave it. She had to look back. She had to turn back. And there's consequences for that. She became a pillar of salt. I can't imagine what that would actually look like, seeing someone turn into a pillar of salt. But it had to be something incredible to see. How did all this happen? How did we get from one small conflict between an uncle and his nephew who were following after God? How did we get from there to here? How did Lot end up with such faith to say, I'm going to follow God, I'm going to follow my uncle, this is what God has for us to do? How does a guy go from there to a couple of chapters later, here where we find him? Well, it all started with a look, and then he made a choice, and then he tried to cover it up with having it both ways. Then he's in open rebellion, doing what he wants, and finally he ends up leading others to sin. There's a progression to all of this. And Lot never repented while he was in the progression. He never realized what was happening. He never turned back to God. I believe Abram probably tried to tell him when he went back and rescued him, hey son, now listen, I love you. I care about you. I can't imagine Abraham not doing this. It's not in the Bible. My imagination just goes kind of crazy when I read the Bible. But I can't imagine Abram's not saying, hey, listen, son, this happened because of where you were living. I love you. This isn't where you need to be. But Lot didn't listen. So all of this happens to Lot because he started just with a look. He started looking at things he shouldn't have been looking at. He started thinking about things he shouldn't have been thinking about. All because he couldn't get along with his uncle. So, what happened because of this? Lot had some serious consequences because of this. His home and possessions were destroyed in the city. He takes off, verse 26 says, but Lot's wife looked back. She was turned into the pillar of salt. Lost his wife, lost his home, lost everything. It's gone. Verse 30. Afterwards, Lot left Zoar because he was afraid of the people living there. He went to live in a cave. Now he's living in a cave. And it gets worse. While they're living in the cave, his two daughters get together and say, hey, there's nobody else alive around us. Let's get dad drunk. I'll sleep with him tonight. You sleep with him tomorrow night so that we can keep our family line going. Do you see how the depravity just keeps going and going and going? Now Lot's decisions are affected his kids. So what happens? They do it. They get him drunk. The oldest daughter sleeps with her dad. Then the next night, they get him drunk again. And the younger daughter goes in and has a relationship. And verse 36, as a result, both of Lot's daughters became pregnant by their own father. That's just gross. That's horrible. The older daughter gave birth to a son and named him Moab, and he became the ancestors of the nation known as the Moabites. You ever heard of them in the Bible? Later on, God told the nation of Israel to kill all the Moabites. Why? Because they began an incest. They began away from God. This was not supposed to have happened. That group of people did nothing but cause harm to God's people. When the younger daughter gave birth to a son, she named him Ben-Ammi, which became the ancestors of the Ammonites. Ever heard of the Ammonites in the Bible? Same thing. Coming after causing war and problems amongst the children of Israel. Killed a lot of the children of Israel. So his daughters get him drunk, sleep with him. His daughters have 2 kids that become leaders of 2 nations, Moab and Ammon, that down the road causes major trouble for Abram and his descendants, God's chosen people. Sin always has consequences, and those consequences can reach down generations that we may never even think about it. There's always more effects than we could ever just imagine. Now, all that's just introduction. Now, it's 11:17. I've been going for about 20 minutes, so now let's get started. About 30 more minutes. Dave's the only one nodding. He's like, yeah. Ruby's like, oh, Lord have mercy. No, I'm kidding. It's quick, I promise. That's the long part. This is the short part. Here we go. It all started because Lot entertained sin in his mind. This all happened because Lot entertained the wrong thing. What we think about is so important because sin always begins in our mind. That's why Paul tells us in 2 Corinthians to take every thought into captivity. Life follows our thoughts, and our thoughts, it follows the direction of our heart, and our direction of our heart follows our thoughts. So my life follows the way I think. What I think is where I go. So I have to be careful what I'm thinking about. That's why Paul says in Philippians 4, think about things that are true, honorable, right, pure, lovely, admirable, all things that are excellent and worthy of praise. So what are we thinking about? Because that determines the direction of our life. What am I thinking about? See, nobody knows our thoughts but us, right? When I start to do things, people can see it, but when I think about things, nobody knows what I'm thinking about but me. And God. But what am I thinking about? This all started because Lot was entertaining this in his mind. Then, God gave Lot several chances to get right. God gave Lot multiple opportunities. And that's awesome because we have a God who's so long-suffering. He does the same thing for us, doesn't he? Gives us chance after chance after chance after chance to come back to him. Lot could have turned away from sin and Sodom at any point, even after his uncle came and rescued him and sat him down probably and said, listen, son, this isn't the way you should be going. God gave him opportunity after opportunity, but Lot didn't listen. God gave him chances, but he didn't do it. Here's the third lesson we can learn in the story. People who are away from God don't share their faith. A good test to see where you are spiritually is if you're sharing your faith. Lot, if he was living in Sodom, if they had just reached 4 people, they could have saved the whole city. How many thousands of people died because one guy didn't share his faith? Here's the next one. Our sin has consequences. Lot lost his home, lost his possessions, lost his wife, lost his marriage. His kids got messed up pretty bad. His grandkids had to carry a lot of baggage. And they did nothing but war with God's people over the next few generations. Numbers 14 says, the Lord is slow to anger and filled with unfailing love, forgiving every kind of sin and rebellion, but he does not excuse the guilty. He lays the sins of the parents upon their children. The entire family is affected, even the children to the 3rd and 4th generations. What we do impacts our kids and our grandkids and our great-grandkids. We have to be careful. So how do we avoid it? Well, we got to be careful what we look at and what we think about. Psalm 101 says, I will refuse to look at anything vile and vulgar. How could this have all stopped? Lot needed to control his thought life. Job 31:1, I made a covenant with my eyes not to look with lust at a young woman. Job says, I'm going to be careful what I look at. I'm not even going to lust after things. We talked about lust in our last series. 2 Corinthians 10, we capture their rebellious thoughts and teach them to obey Christ. We're going to capture our thoughts. We've got to be careful what we think about. Philippians 4:8, fix your thoughts on what is true, honorable, pure, right, lovely, admirable. Think about the things that are excellent and worthy of praise. Lot could have changed a lot of people's lives if he had controlled his mind. So what are we thinking about? What goes on in our mind? Because that's where it starts. So, oh, that'd be faster, right? So let's talk about it. What jumps out in the story to you? It's kind of a depressing story, Dave.
Well, that sin progression, the kind of the last step of it, is where what's sinful becomes normal and accepted, and what's right becomes abnormal and not accepted and even persecuted. And if you go to Romans chapter 1, like one of the main symptoms of a people that have been just given over to their lust is the prevalence of homosexuality.
Yeah.
That's one of the signs, the good signs of people that have gotten past that point of, where they'll even accept what's right. And in fact, it says right there that they will accept what's wrong and rejoice in it and reject anybody that tries to tell them otherwise. And it's a real thing. And unfortunately, we've progressed to that point in this country. I mean, we have a month where we celebrate what God destroyed cities over. Because that's the point we're at in that sin progression, where the sinful part is normal and accepted, and righteousness is rejected and even made fun of and actually persecuted. And
Yeah.
that's where Sodom ended up, and that's unfortunately where we are in our country today.
Yeah. Yeah, with the men coming in after the two angels wanting to have a relationship with them. It blows me away, though, that they just, these were two guys that just walked into town and they came right after them. There was no shame, there was no embarrassment, there was no anything. They went to Lot like he was their buddy and said, hey, bud, let us have them. And then for Lot to say, no, just take my daughters. That just blows me away.
That had become normal.
Yeah. You're right. Absolutely. Anybody else?
I think about how, Lot's wife turned into a pillar of salt, and Jesus, the Sermon on the Mount, says that we're supposed to be salt and light to the world. And so it's interesting that salt was the form that she took. But when Jesus talks about us being salt and light, he means that, especially back in those days, salt was used as a preserver of food, and how we're supposed to preserve people around us. And just in that example, when the Lord's talking to Abraham and says, if I find 10, just 10, those 10 righteous could have preserved an entire community. And even if people aren't necessarily getting saved around us in the numbers and ways that we'd like to see, we can still be salt to them and preserve them, because God is patient and kind, and that allows them opportunity to turn to the Lord.
Yep.
And so what a privilege, what a responsibility we have to be salt, and to not conform to the patterns that are happening around us, the patterns of the world, but Paul talks about being transformed by the way that we think, the renewing of our minds, and that makes a significant difference in the areas that we're serving.
I've often wondered, and I did again while I was reading, I wondered why did God turn her into salt instead of, just dirt or stone or something else? And I don't know that I have a really good answer for that, just honestly. But I've thought about that many times. Why salt? There has to be a reason. Why salt? And it reminded me of there's an old joke that preachers tell. Bill, your dad's probably told this because my dad told it a million times. Is the little boy in Sunday school, they were talking about this story and they asked what happened to Lot's wife. And the little boy said, well, she turned into a pillar of salt by day and a pillar of fire by night. Did your dad ever tell that one?
I don't know.
Mine told it all the time. Yeah. Pam?
I liked, and you pointed it out, so it reminded me of God's heart, seeing God's heart, and also the way Abraham, at that time, he got it. He was following God's heart as well. When, God brought adversity to Lot to have him captured, and that didn't turn him around. And then, Abraham decided to go help him, but Abram could have said, he's getting what he deserved.
Yeah.
He chose that life. That's what he gets. Forget it. But he went and down and helped him, and and then God's the one that helped him get him out of that. I mean, God was doing. He tried the hard love. He tried the love, and Lot wasn't having it, I guess. But I like to see all of. We get so many chances too for different things, and then sometimes we don't have the heart of God, and we're like, I'm not talking to those people, you just kind of do like the Samaritan and step over him or whatever. But that's not God's heart, and I like that Abraham, he was on it too, following God at that time.
Yeah, he could have very easily said, he's getting what he deserved. Yeah, it's true, Pam. Definitely could have. And how many times have we done that? They're getting what they deserve. That wasn't Abram's heart. It wasn't God's heart either. That's good. Anybody else? Bill?
We don't think we relate to Lot and making bad choices, but we can find ourselves right there with him too. He moved down in the valley, and but he didn't. And then later on, he just goes right in and lives inside of Sodom, sit at the gates, and so that meant that he was a man that the city considered with wisdom, that they would go to. And I like what you said about Job too. Job said that he chose not to look after a woman, to lust after her or whatever, And when you think about the gifts of the Spirit, we think about love, joy, peace, long-suffering, but we forget about that one that says self-control. Mm-hmm. We have the Holy Spirit living inside of us, but God still, He wants us to choose self-control, in our lives, and that's what Lot didn't do, and us living in this world, we're bombarded every day by different things, The TV, can become a tool against God, by what we watch, or the same with things that we listen to, and pretty soon we can just gradually, not be any different than the world. So we have to choose self-control in things that we do too.
Absolutely. Good, Bill.
I was just thinking how Abraham took an army of 318 and beat the winning army.
Yeah.
That's a pretty good outcome.
Yeah.
God must have been with that enterprise.
I would think so,
Yeah.
Yeah, my mind was picturing, a movie with, I'm very visual, so when they went to war, I was reading that, I'm like, wow, 318? It must have been like ninjas or something, coming in. And
Well, he even split them up, it says.
yeah. Yep. It's an amazing story. Anybody else?
And they were all his children? Those were his children?
Those were his and the children of the people that were following him. So he had all these herds, and so he had to take a whole group of people with him to take care of all. So these were the kids and those that had been born to those that were his followers. And
I was amazed how he would have 318 children.
he'd need a job. That's a lot of kids.
They were employees.
Yeah, basically.
They were servants. I'd like your boss to come to you and say, hey, we're going to go and attack these armies here. What? With 300 people? Okay, boss. Yes, sir.
Anybody else? Okay. Well, with talking about this today and looking at it from Abraham's side, how he had Lot that he loved and cared for, was one of his relatives, and he went away from him, and he ran from the Lord, and he just wouldn't come back, and God had to do things in his life. It made me think about how many of us have people in our lives, family members, friends that are away from the Lord that need us to be Abraham in their life. When I was thinking about that, I thought, we pray over each other so many times and pray for, physical things and ask God to do healings and God to do things like that. But we need to pray for those that we love, that we care about, that are away from the Lord, for a miracle for them. So this morning I wanted us to spend, just as we finish up, how many of you have somebody like that in your family? Away from the Lord, needs a miracle. Yeah, we do. All of us probably, most of us do. So let's spend some time, let's pray for that. Who wants to be, anybody who wants to pray for it, let's pray for it. If you've got, like